Ecce agnostai qui tollit peccatum mundi. Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, changed the world forever. The effects of this can be seen even in science, technology, history, art, and culture. In this podcast, we explore these effects and learn what it means for us today to follow the Lamb. I'm Joshua Göcking, and you're listening to the Follow the Lamb podcast. Preview of the episodes 9 to 12, Transformation. Episode 9, the transformation from tragedy to comedy. So welcome back to the Follow the Lamb podcast. So as you might have noticed by now, the behavior is always like this, that I will first write the articles on my Substack, followthelamb.substack.com. There you can read them in real time, so as they coming out, you can directly read them. I will immediately publish them as soon as I have finished them. So if you want to be up to date always, I recommend you to read them there. Otherwise, I will, as soon as I'm able to record them, I will record the podcast episodes. Most of the times it will be 4 episodes that I will record all together at once, and then I will publish them with a preview and then the episodes individually. So if you would like to listen to them, then you need to be a little bit more patient. But if you don't mind reading, then I really recommend you to read the articles on my Substack. So now, without further ado, we want to dive into the new episodes. So in this first episode, it's about the transformation from tragedy to comedy. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Revelation 21 verse 4. The most important genres of drama are tragedies and comedies. These forms already existed in the theater of ancient Greece. While comedies are characterized by their cheerful mood and happy endings, tragedies depict the inevitable failure of a protagonist who usually meets his death. Another element of a tragedy is its hopelessness. The ending is predetermined from the outset, and every attempt by the protagonists to escape it fails. This is clearly illustrated in the tragedy of Oedipus Rex, from Sophocles from ancient Greece. Oedipus' parents are prophesied that their son will one day kill his father and marry his mother. To prevent this, they hire a shepherd to abandon him in the mountains to his fate. The shepherd takes pity on him and saves the child. When Oedipus is also prophesied that he will kill his father and marry his mother, he flees from his adoptive parents, whom he considers to be his biological parents, to prevent this from happening. During his flight, he gets into a fight with a man and kills him. This man later turns out to be his biological father. He arrives in Thebes, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, a monster that terrorized the city, and defeats it. So the riddle of the Sphinx is rather well known. It's known from this story of King Oedipus or Oedipus Rex, who solves the riddle of the Sphinx. And just as a side note, this riddle is the following. I'm not sure if it's phrased that way in the works, probably not. But it basically comes down to this question: what walks on 4 feet in the morning, on 2 in the afternoon, and on 3 in the evening? And the answer to this riddle is man. So man is in its beginning stages as a child, as a baby. He's not able to walk yet, but he's crawling. So he's crawling on all 4s, so 4 feet. And in the afternoon, so when he grew up, he gets to walk on 2 feet. And in the evening, he's an old man who needs a walking cane to walk, and therefore is basically walking on 3 legs. So this is the riddle and its solution, and Oedipus solves this riddle. And as a thank you, basically, for freeing them from this monster, the people of Thebes pronounce them their king because their king recently passed away. And he also gets to marry their queen, which is, as it turns out, his biological mother. So the efforts of Oedipus and his parents to prevent the prophecy from coming true by any means necessary ultimately led to its fulfillment. This is a prime example of the hopelessness faced by protagonists in tragedies, where their decisions have no influence on the tragic outcome of the plot. So just if you imagine, if the parents of Oedipus would not have abandoned him and let this shepherd bring him to the mountains to leave them to their fate, then he would not have come to this different family where he thought them to be his biological parents, and then he would not this would not have come to pass this way. And if he would not have try to prevent his prophecy by running away from the parents that he believed to be his biological parents, he would not have come into the situation where he basically fulfilled the prophecy. So by basically trying to avoid the prophecy, they fulfilled it. And this is a basic tragic plot, or also the outcome of a basic tragic plot. And you might now think that since this is kind of predictable, that tragedies make that this predictability makes these tragedies less appealing or less interesting to audience than other genres. However, the opposite is true. Most of the best-known plays of antiquity are tragedies, and Shakespeare's best-known works such as Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and Romeo and Juliet are also all tragedies. His comedies, such as A Midsummer's Night Dream and Much Ado About Nothing, are not as well known as those tragedies. So why is that? One possible explanation is that this is the reason for this is that comedies are also more predictable because their happy ending is also already baked in the cake at the beginning. You already know that there will be a happy ending, and no matter what happens, no matter how tragic it will get in between, you will know that the ending will be happy. More importantly, however, the reasons for this seem to lie in the fact that people usually can identify better with the plot of the tragedy. We have learned that art always reflects the world as it is. In this respect, comedies, like tragedies, reflect our world as it is. The fact that tragedies have a greater impact suggests that they reflect the state of the world more accurately. Comedies usually thrive on an exaggerated portrayal of characters and their weaknesses, which further reinforces this point. So comedies describe also the world as it is, but since they tend to exaggerate it in an extreme way, this makes it more or less realistic than, for example, tragedies are, and maybe this is the reason why tragedies have a greater impact on us than comedies. This does not mean that tragedies are always better than comedies, nor that they are more popular. Most of the time, comedies are preferred by audiences because of their cheerful nature. However, the influence that tragedies have on us seems to be greater because of their greater realism. So this brings us to the tragic state of the world. The greater realism that tragedies seem to have is evident in the fact that the entire state of the world is understood as tragic. We often try to classify events in world history as good or bad. We also try to squeeze individual empires that appeared in world history into such a mold. On closer inspection, however, it becomes clear that this is not as that it is not that simple. The truth is more complex, and developments that we consider negative today reveal positive features or even a necessity when viewed more closely, especially in a historical context. For example, the era of colonialism is largely viewed negatively today. It is true that the colonialists caused the tragic deaths of many indigenous peoples. However, far more than conscious acts, for example through the conquests, these can be attributed to unconscious effects such as pathogens to which the indigenous people had not yet developed an immune response. The conquest of the indigenous people's land is viewed critically today. This usually creates the impression that the indigenous people previously lived in permanent peace on their relative lands. However, this is not accurate. Most indigenous peoples were divided into tribes that fought each other and took land away from each other. Gestures of acknowledgement of land ownership towards indigenous peoples are difficult because it is usually hard to determine which of the tribes that owned this land at a certain time should receive this acknowledgement. It is believed that the Aztecs originally came from northern Mexico or even the south of what is now the United States, and that they migrated south from there and oppressed the tribes living there. When Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztecs, he did so not only with the help of his Spanish compatriots, but also with the help of the tribes that had been oppressed by the Aztecs. This already shows the difficulty of such black and white pictures. Another example that shows that colonialism must be viewed in a more nuanced way is evident when one realizes that human sacrifice was a common practice among Aztecs and many other colonized peoples. This practice was ended by the European colonialists. Criticism of colonialism today is based on a contemporary perspective that overlooks the fact that many things we take for granted today, such as the widespread absence of human sacrifice across cultures, were only achieved through colonialism. This does not mean that colonialism was something entirely positive. It was often interspersed with racist views of the oppressed tribes and a sense of superiority. It would also be wrong to assume that the colonialists acted solely out of good intentions and did not exploit their such subjects. Joseph Conrad describes the cruelty and madness with which colonialism was carried out in his work Heart of Darkness. To properly contextualize history, it is therefore not enough to classify individual events as good or bad. Rather, it is necessary to recognize that every positive development also has negative consequences, but is nevertheless necessary if the positive outweighs the negative. This is still the case today, and an inability to recognize the tragic nature of the world often leads to symbolic action that at best do not improve the situation and at worst even worsen it. This is no different in the history of Christianity or the history of the Church. Many Protestants are convinced that the separation of church and state is an important asset. Emperor Constantine's declaration of Christianity as the state religion of Rome is considered a great mistake. However, as described above, this takes something for granted that was only achieved through the church as the state religion. Before Constantine became emperor of Rome, it was a tetrarchy. That is, it was divided among 4 rulers. Emperor Diocletian had made this adjustment in order to better govern the vast empire. Just like Diocletian, the rulers carried out cruel persecutions of Christians. Only Constantine showed himself to be extremely tolerant towards Christians. According to legend, in his struggle for the sole rule over the Roman Empire, he saw a cross or a Chi-Rho in the sky and had a vision and heard the words, "In this sign you shall conquer," or "In this be victorious." He had the cross painted or the Chi-Rho painted on the shields of his troops and was victorious. It cannot be ruled out without Constantine's victory, the persecutions of Christians would have continued, and it is questionable whether Christianity would have continued to grow under these circumstances. It was also Constantine who convened the First Council of Nicaea to settle the Arian controversy. So the Arian controversy was basically, it was really a fight between Christians where they fought about the true nature of Jesus. Basically, the question was if Jesus is the Son of God, but he's also God, how can this be? Has Jesus always existed, but then how can he have been conceived, and so on? And it was about the true substance of Jesus, whether he was really God, like God the Father is God, or if he was kind of like inferior to that, and some questions like this. So it was a really complex topic, so I won't dive into all the theological depths of that discussion right now, but I just want to say it was a pretty hard-fought battle. It was not just the Christians discussing with each other. They even faked a murder and said the other people who, the Arians, I think, faked a murder and told the other ones were behind it, and so on. So it was a really hard-fought battle, and Constantine wanted to clear the battle up. He wanted to get a resolution. He seems to not be that much in favor of what kind of resolution, or whether this would be a theological correct resolution. That was kind of not a concept he had. He was used to Roman religion that worked differently, but he wanted to have it settled. Therefore he convened in this First Council of Nicaea. And what is interesting about this, at this council, the Nicene Creed that is used across denominations today and is the clearest definition of our faith was there created, and it was they unified on this creed. And even today, I think, even with all the different churches and denominations that we have, we still can come together in this one creed, which is pretty amazing, pretty amazing what was achieved there. And therefore, this is also not to be put under the rug. So the separation between church and state is a hard-won achievement. At that time, however, there was no awareness of this, and so Christianity as the state church was a better alternative than the pagan religion that persecuted Christianity with utmost severity. It was only from this constellation that a realization of the necessity of separating church and state could arise, which was then also accompanied by tragic elements. The reason why it was considered necessary to have a state religion is that religion provides an accepted standard for what is true. If state and church are separated, and the standard for what is considered to be true is also abolished, which can lead to a great deal of confusion. This is one of the results of the Reformation movement. In addition to the numerous insights into faith gained by questioning certain unbiblical premises, this questioning of everything also gave rise to the Enlightenment, which resulted in materialism and atheism. So one may now ask how this tragic nature of the world came about. From a Christian perspective, the answer can be found in the fall. Because the world is under the power of sin, every decision has such a tragic component. This is reinforced by the very nature of sin, which punishes not only those who commit it, but often also those who have nothing to do with the sin committed. Jesus points this out when the disciples, upon encountering a man blind from birth, asked him who sinned in this case, causing him to be afflicted with this disability. This is in John 9, 1 verse 3, where it says, "As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' 'Neither this man nor his parents sinned,' said Jesus, 'but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" Jesus affirms that neither he nor his parents have sinned. He thus explains the condition with the tragic overall state of the world and immediately names the role God plays in it. His works are to be revealed in this tragic world. In doing so, Jesus sets a good example and heals the blind man by forming a paste from his saliva and the earth and applying it to the blind man's eyes. He instructs the blind man to wash himself in a pool called Sand One, and the blind man is healed. This is probably one of the most peculiar miracles of Jesus that has been recorded. It is quite obviously a symbolic act. Jesus takes that which is subject to tragic nature and brings it into contact with himself. So he brings the earth into, or the earth into contact with his saliva. In this way, it becomes the substance, so this paste, that takes away the tragedy, so this disability that the blind man had. Jesus' life is an embodiment of this process. God, who is righteous and without sin, comes into a world infected by sin and injustice. Instead of receiving him with open arms, the tragic sinful state of the world leads it to condemn and execute him. But it is precisely this apparent tragedy that God uses to achieve victory over sin and death. When I was first confronted with the statement that tragedies affect people more deeply than comedies, I knew immediately that it was true, but I wondered why. After all, anyone who has internalized the gospel would expect that a joyful message would have a deeper impact. That is true, but it depends on your perspective. I had the impression that he was saying, that God was saying, I transform all tragedies into comedies. From a human perspective, Jesus' condemnation and death on the cross was an absolute tragedy. However, from God's perspective and in view of his resurrection, it was a success story, and in the sense of a happy ending and the absolute exposure of the enemy, a comedy. In one podcast episode I did, still on the Sci-Faith podcast, it was called a Transformation to Rest. And in this I discussed the interesting property of theoretical physics, that it is always possible to view the problems of physics from a perspective in which they are already solved. In physics, it is usually more difficult to find this transformation than to solve the problem, but it illustrates precisely this point. From God's perspective, the problems are already solved. As Christians, we can know that although we are not automatically spared from tragic events, since we still live in this sinful world, God will, as with the paste that healed the blind man, take away the tragedy. This may be a literal removal of the tragedy as with the blind man, or he may transform it to give us his perspective in which it appears in his light. It is important to understand that this does not mean that everything will always feel and appear to be hunky-dory on the outside. After Jesus' death on the cross, his disciples were in mourning. We often read this knowing what happens next, but the disciples were not aware of this, even though Jesus told them very clearly several times, but they did not understand. For them in those hours, everything was over. The man they had staked everything on had, to all appearances, failed. What's more, their greatest teacher and friend had died. Later in the early years of Christianity, the church had to endure many tragic experiences with the deaths of numerous martyrs, and did not immediately see how all this could turn out for the good. It may be the same for us, that we have to go through tragic experiences whose meaning we will only understand later or even only in heaven. In such moments we need more than ever the faith that he can and will turn every tragic situation into a joyful one. This the cross as the ultimate tragedy that was transformed into good news serves as an eternal proof of this. Episode 10, the Nobel Prize in Physics 2025. That all of them may be one Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. John 17, verse 21. This year's Nobel Prize in Physics goes to 3 physicists, John Clark, Michel Devoret, and John Martinis, for the discovery of macroscopic quantum tunneling and energy quantization in an electrical unit. This work, which demonstrates that quantum effects can also operate at a macroscopic level, is of utmost importance in the field of quantum computer research and implementation, which has made great strides in recent years. In this article, we examine the underlying physical effects of this discovery and how they can be interpreted from a faith perspective. So for this, we first need to look at some quantum effects, and the one effect we want to consider is the tunnel effect. So the tunnel effect is an interesting phenomenon in quantum mechanics. In classical physics, an energy barrier is always insurmountable for a particle with less energy. This is dictated by the conservation of energy. For example, if I start riding my bike at a certain speed and ride up a hill without pedaling, I will only be able to overcome this hill if my initial energy is high enough. The type of hurdle that the hill represents there is usually referred to in physics as a potential. If a particle is in such a potential, quantum mechanics suggests that the particle may be found on the other side of the potential, even if it has less energy than the potential hill it requires. How can this be? The tunnel effect allows the particle to tunnel through the potential barrier, that is, to pass through the wall, so to speak. How can this effect be reconciled with the conservation of energy? From Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which states that position and momentum cannot precisely be determined, the equivalent uncertainty principle of energy and time can be derived. This states that at short intervals there can be a high degree of uncertainty in the energy of a particle, which allows such a tunneling to occur. However, if all energy amounts are added together, the energy is conserved. The tunnel effect therefore does not contradict any physical laws and occurs in many places in nature. However, there is no macroscopic analog to this. It would be as if every now and then people running into a wall pass through it instead of bouncing off it. One example of the tunneling effect is nuclear fusion. Here, 2 protons fuse to form a helium nucleus consisting of 1 proton and 1 neutron. That is, one of the protons is converted into a neutron via the weak interaction, which then emits a positron, which is a positive electron, so the antiparticle of the electron, and a neutrino. The positively charged protons repel each other and must overcome this potential barrier of repulsion in order to fuse. Even the high temperatures, these energies that are present in the sun, are not sufficient for this. The tunneling effects allows the protons to penetrate this barrier. The situation is similar with radioactive alpha radiation. Here radioactive material, for example uranium, emits helium nuclei, so this is alpha particles, and these come from the uranium nucleus. According to classical physics, they cannot overcome the potential barrier. By exploiting the tunnel effect, they can free themselves from the clutches of their atomic nucleus. The importance of the tunnel effect is demonstrated by the hydrogen bonding. This unique type of atomic bonding only occurs in hydrogen compounds, and in this process the electron in the shell of one hydrogen atom is shared with the shell of the other atom. The electron tunnels back and forth between the two points. This effect causes water to form hexagonal crystal patterns and is the only element that is less dense in its solid state than in its liquid state. This is why ice floats on water instead of the other way around, which is essential for the life of aquatic animals. So this anomaly in the water, which leads to this higher density in a liquid state, leads to ice swimming on the water and therefore also fish being able to live. So this little anomaly that results from this tunnel effect has huge impacts on life on this world. The tunnel effect has also been made technically usable in scanning tunneling microscopes. Here a very thin tip moves over the surface being examined. At a constant distance, the electron tunnel back and forth between the tip and the surface, which can be measured as a tunnel current. So if you know these particles, they are charged particles and they tunnel between this barrier, and since they are charged, there will be a current flowing, and this you can measure. This allows surfaces to be resolved more accurately than it is possible with conventional light microscopes. This can be wonderful interpreted in the spirit, because in a spiritual sense, this effect can be interpreted as showing that no barrier is too great for our God. Even if there is a seemingly insurmountable circumstance, God can tunnel us through it, as in the tunnel effect. In Luke 18, verse 27, Jesus says that what is impossible for humans is possible for God. This quantum effect is a sign that with God the impossible is possible. Jesus himself demonstrated this on a macroscopic level in his ministry when he appeared to his disciples after his resurrection while they were in a locked room. Jesus must have overcome this energy barrier, which is impossible. Just as the tunnel effect allows this on a quantum level, God is even able to overcome the limits of physics on a macroscopic level. So now we want to talk also about another effect that was relevant to this Nobel Prize, and this is the effect of superconductivity. This quantum mechanical effect allows electricity to flow without resistance in a cold medium. Most people are familiar with Ohm's law from school. They are also known as the three Uri laws. Here U stands for electrical voltage, R for resistance, and I for the current. And then it holds that U is equal to R times I. Through various transformations, an expression can be found for each variable depending on the two other variables. The three versions are therefore referred to as three separate laws, although it is only one law. Ohm's law. What it says is simple. Every conductor has a resistance that determines how high the current is when a voltage is applied. How does this resistance come about? As we learned in the article The Physics of the Aura, or in the episode 2 of The Physics of the Aura, the temperature of a body is a result of the random movement of individual atoms. Metals are substances in which the electrons of the outermost atomic shell can move freely. A solid body can be understood as a lattice with individual atoms at its nodes. Due to their temperature, each of these atoms is in random motion which affects every node of the lattice. When an electric current is applied, it is almost impossible for the electrons to not come into contact with these atoms, which causes resistance. Therefore, bodies with a temperature above absolute zero exhibit resistance. In some materials, resistance-free conduction can be observed even before absolute zero. This effect is called superconductivity and has not yet been fully explained. The best description of this effect is currently provided by the so-called BCS theory, named after its developers John Bardeen, Leon Neil Cooper, and John Robert Schrieffer, who were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1972 for their achievements. This theory postulates a weak interaction or weak attraction between two electrons which are bound together to form so-called Cooper pairs. Electrons are fermions, which means they cannot share an energy state. This is only possible if they differ in one property. The only intrinsic property in which they can differ is their spin. This is kind of an intrinsic angular momentum, and this can take two values in electrons. For this reason, only two electrons can fit into the first atomic shell. Later atomic shells provide further degrees of freedom, such as orbital angular momentum, so that more electrons can fit in here. As Cooper pairs, the electron can achieve an integer spin either through opposite spin or parallel spin, while individually they are half integer spin. So half integer spin is exactly what the fermions are. They have a half integer spin, and this means they can take they are fermions, and this means that they have this exclusion principle, which basically states that only one fermion can take one energetic state. They can have the same energetic state if they distinguish themselves in one property that they have, and if they only have intrinsically their spin as it is in the basic shell, then there will only be two electrons fitting. In upper shells there are more than those degrees of freedom, like angular momentum and so on, and so they can have more particles in their shell, but also there is a limit. So usually it's eight electrons that are in the upper shells. And this, when the electrons now build these Cooper pairs, then they can add their spins to each other, and then it will be an integer spin. So it will be 1, 2, 3, and so on, this integer spin. And this means that they are no longer fermions, but as a pair, or they are still fermions individually, but as a pair they are bosons. And this is important because bosons are like light particles are also bosons, and they can take the same energetic state, and they even prefer it because they want to minimize the energy, and therefore they can take the lowest energy state and they get all in there. And if there is something which is like this and has all these the same energy state, then you call this this is a condensate, and you call this the Bose-Einstein condensate. But since the Cooper pairs are so far apart, so the electrons, they attract each other with this weak interaction, but they are actually far apart because otherwise, of course, the electromagnetic interaction would dominate. So, and this leads to they're not really building a Bose-Einstein condensate, but nonetheless they have this behavior that they are in a ground state of the lowest energy, and they want to keep their energy minimal. And this means in such a body that the current will flow without resistance because it's energetically less efficient to resist this movement, to have a resistant, but it is more efficient to just seamlessly flow. And this explains why it is possible for a body which is not at a temperature of absolute zero to have no resistance when a current is flowing. This is exactly due to this effect of the Cooper pairs that build build basically bosons that then are in the same state, and then it's energetically more efficient for them to flow without any resistance. So the effect of superconductivity is then also a macroscopic effect because there are many particles involved in this quantum mechanical state. However, usually this is not the case. Usually, due to the effect of decoherence, these quantum effects are limited to only a few particles, but here you have a quantum mechanical effect that spreads over many particles, that is macroscopic, as the physicists say. And I think we can conclude from this also something for our spiritual life, because the effect of conductivity, especially as described in the BCS theory, can be interpreted wonderfully in spiritual terms. Electrons naturally repel each other in the same way we humans may clash with each other here and there. Like electrons in a metal, we do not only collide with each other, but also with atoms whizzing around us when electricity is applied. At sufficiently low temperatures, the electrons begin to overcome their repulsion and enter into a weak interaction, forming pairs that all transition into the same state and flow as a single unit without resistance. In the same way, when we allow ourselves to be led into the peace of the Lord, we can overcome our earthly repulsions and come together in divine agape love, moving forward as one. In this unity, we then flow without any resistance. So now let's talk about what the Nobel Prize was actually awarded to. And the prize winners used these two effects to describe these two effects we described before, to demonstrate quantum mechanics on a macroscopic level, that is, on the level of many particles. This is not usually possible because quantum mechanics only occurs on the microscopic level, that is, the level of individual particles. The effect of so-called decoherence prevents quantum effects from occurring at a macroscopic level, which is also the reason why we never encounter these effects directly in our everyday lives. In the experiments, the prize winners used superconducting material and positioned a thin, non-conductive layer between it. This is called a Josephson function, named after the British physicist Brian Josephson, who described the Josephson effect that occurs in this constellation. This effect generates a tunnel current in the material. As described, the electrons in the superconducting material form Cooper pairs and are all in the same state. According to the rules of classical physics, they cannot overcome the non-conductive barrier at the Josephson function. However, the tunnel effect of quantum mechanics makes this possible. The Cooper pairs tunnel through the barrier into the neighboring superconducting material, which generates a voltage. Without applying a voltage, the experimentalists see how this voltage is generated, confirming the tunneling effect on a microscopic level. In further experiments, they were also able to show that the transferred energy is transferred in discrete packets, that is quanta, which is another effect of quantum mechanics. Their work is significant not only because it sheds light on quantum effects and on the microscopic level, but also because it has practical applications. These quantized energy states can be used to generate units of information, so-called quantum bits or qubits. These are also subject to the laws of quantum mechanics, and in addition to the two logical states 1 and 0, can also assume a superposition of these two states. This allows for higher computing power. A computer with such qubits is called a quantum computer. Several of these have already been realized, and even though most quantum computers realize qubits in a different way, the findings of the award winners were already fundamental to the development of modern quantum computers. Episode 11. To be or not to be. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. Beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Hamlet, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Hamlet is considered the greatest play in English literature, if not in all of modern Western literature. To this day, more than 400 years after its premiere, it has lost none of its relevance, quite to the contrary. It can be understood as one of the first works of modernity, especially one with a character that reflects the psyche of our modern age like no other. So, what is it about? At the center of the plot, there is Hamlet, son of the recently deceased King of Denmark, who is studying in Wittenberg. After the king's death, his brother, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, became the new king. Only a few months after his death, he married the king's widow, Gertrude. Hamlet is less than enthusiastic about this development and criticizes above all that so soon after his father's death, no one but him seems to be mourning. The plot begins with the apparition of that Hamlet's friends, including Horatio, see and identify as Hamlet's father, or the ghost of Hamlet's father. Something's rotten in the state of Denmark, is how Hamlet's friend Marcellus aptly sums up the situation. They alert Hamlet to the apparition, and the following night he joins them and sees the ghost as well. It begins to speak to him and reveals itself to be the ghost of Hamlet's father. It also reveals that the new king, Claudius, his brother, murdered him and demands that Hamlet avenge him. From then on, Hamlet is plagued with indecision as to whether he should comply with the ghost's demands or dismiss the apparition as a deception. He decides to pretend to be mad so that Claudius does not become suspicious while he investigates the ghost's accusations. Soon, the court becomes concerned about Hamlet's apparent madness. The king's close confidant Polonius believes it is because his daughter Ophelia does not return his love after he and his son Laertes have warned her urgently against associating with Hamlet. When Hamlet encounters actors passing through, he devises a plan to have a play performed that fits Claudius's accusations like a glove. He wants to use Claudius' reaction to determine whether he did indeed murder his father. The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. That's what he says. The plan works. Claudius interrupts the performance. Gertrude confronts Hamlet while Polonius listens behind the curtain. Hamlet mistakes him for Claudius and accidentally stabs him to death. Ophelia, who believes she has now lost her lover to madness and has also lost her father, descends into madness herself, and as we later see, apparently commits suicide by drowning. Claudius sends Hamlet to England on a mission with the plan to have him killed there. When Hamlet escapes the murder plot and returns alive from England, Claudius decides to convince Laertes to take revenge on Hamlet for the death of his father Polonius. They plan a rigged duel with a poisoned weapon and additionally poisoned wine. The plan backfires when Gertrude accidentally drinks of the poisoned wine. Hamlet and Laertes are both fatally wounded with the poisoned blade, and Claudius is killed by Hamlet before Hamlet himself dies. In his last words, Hamlet asks Horatio to tell his story and gives his consent for Fortinbras, the king of Norway, who invades from Poland to rule his country in the future. Shakespeare's tragedies are said to always end with everyone dead. This is definitely true of Hamlet. Only Horatio remains alive to tell the tale. Some may find this repulsive, but those who can bear it will gain a lot from this work. Even in such tragedies, there's always an unmistakably beauty in Shakespeare's work. This is not only due to the almost perfectly written prose. On the one hand, many of the sentences Shakespeare uses are closely based in the Bible. The text quoted in the opening quotation can also be found in Psalm 8. where there it says in Psalm 8 verse 4 and 5, it says, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with your glory and honor." So to compare this to the initial quote is, which is from Hamlet, this is, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" So you see there are some changes. It's not exactly the same verse, but some parts of these quotes are really pretty closely related to the Bible, or even taken from there kind of one-to-one. So on the other hand, so this is one part why we consider this beautiful. On the other hand, Shakespeare always assumes a moral order in his works, and violating this order has tragic consequences. This moral order is clearly based on the values presented in the Bible. Shakespeare's works are not considered Christian, as they rarely refer explicitly to Christianity. However, they are so permeated with Christian moral values that they can definitely be called Christian. But what exactly does Hamlet describe? How can this work be interpreted? Hamlet is the archetype of the modern man. It is a result of the modern age that questions everything. It is no coincidence that in the play Hamlet studies in Wittenberg, which is the birthplace of the Reformation. Luther's Reformation and the resulting division in the church into Catholic and Protestant led to the institution that had previously had a monopoly on truth being called into question. One difference in belief between Protestants and Catholics was very pronounced at the time, was the belief in purgatory, and thus also the belief in the existence of ghosts. Protestants rejected this, which is why Hamlet initially doubts the reality of his father's ghost's apparition. This doubt leads Hamlet in his madness, the extent of which we never know whether it is feigned or genuine, to make many of the statements that we know today primarily from postmodern worldviews. He responds, for example, mockingly to Polonius' question about what he's reading. Words, words, words. In doing so, he undermines the meaning of language and its ability to describe true facts. In modern theories, two language is usually understood only as a vehicle for exercising power. So just like Hamlet basically defines language to not mean anything, in many postmodern theories it's also considered to be at least not mean what it says, but be just a mean to gain power. This appeal to postmodern worldviews becomes clearer in the quote to Rosencrantz, in which he considers Denmark to be a prison, which Rosencrantz does not confirm, and then Hamlet states, "For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Here Hamlet clearly denies the moral order of the world. Good and evil do not exist outside of human thought and are therefore subjective. What is good for one person may appear evil to another. This is in close agreement with the postmodern theories, which regard good and evil as relative and do not assign them any reality beyond the subjective human perception. It is interesting that these worldviews emerged much later, but their basic features are already contained in Hamlet's words. In this work, Shakespeare already foresaw the consequences of this new modern age. Ideas work their way to their final state, so those who can foresee the consequences of a new idea are often, like Shakespeare, able to predict parts of the future very accurately. But Hamlet's questioning does not stop here. At the climax, he contemplates life and comes to a conclusion that, in my view, shows that these postmodern views ultimately lose themselves in contradictions. He ponders their existence and wonders why, given the many adversities in life, it does not make sense to fall asleep. So, to take one's own life is meant by that. And in this context, the formative quote appears. To be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet wonders whether he would dream in his final sleep. That is, whether there's life after death, and whether that is the reason why one endures these difficulties of life instead of escaping them. He comes to the conclusion, thus conscience makes cowards of us all. Is that true? Do we act cowardly because we consider the possibility of life after death? Or is it a reverence for life and the consequences of our decisions even beyond this life that makes us reflect? Does the fact that we endure the difficulties of life show that we instinctively know that we are not purely material creatures and that our lives have meaning? What must always be taken into account in all these interpretations is that Hamlet is only pretending to be mad the whole time. So he knows that the thoughts he expresses when he questions the meaning of words or relativizes good and evil, that what he says is not true. From this we can conclude that modern man seems to know subconsciously that these ideas are not true, but nevertheless he clings to them. Hamlet does this in order to figure out the next steps without attracting attention. Why do we do it? Are we also still trying to find clarity for our next steps in this situation in which there is no definitive stand for what is true? So the tragic consequences of this indecision of Hamlet's are not only evident in the tragic ending of the play, they are even before that. We see that Hamlet drives the innocent Ophelia into madness, ultimately also into suicide through his feigned madness and his accidental murder of her father. This shows that our actions not only have consequences for us, but also without us wanting it for innocent third parties. This makes it all the more important that we see clarity in such situations instead of flirting with ideas that sound good but are nonsensical. So this is the fate of Ophelia, and this is what also Taylor Swift sings about in her new album, although I am really not sure if we are talking here about the same Ophelia, but I think I will leave that as it is. I won't say more about that. I'd rather continue to speak about what this really means. So what does it mean for the Reformation? We said, or we can clearly see in Shakespeare's work that he is pulling or connecting these questionings to the Reformation, and that he sees this as the trigger for these confusions, and this is well founded since these questions arose only after the Reformation. So was the Reformation therefore a bad thing? No, I don't think, and I don't think that it was Shakespeare's intention to say that or to make that point. In my view, the Reformation was necessary, but like everything else, it also had tragic consequences. What was abolished by the Reformation was the standard of truth provided by the Catholic Church, and without it, the doubts that haunt us to this very day arose. The problem was not that this standard was abolished, but that it existed in a place where it did not belong in the first place. The standard for what is true is not found in the doctrines of a church, however good and right they may be, but in Jesus Christ. With the Reformation and Luther's 5 solas, this was once again made the foundation of truth, although now everyone had to discover this foundation for themselves, and it was no longer imposed from above. In addition to the negative effect of questioning, which the play highlights, it has also many positive effects. Modern science and technological progress are just two of many examples for this. What saves us from suffering the same fate as Hamlet is therefore not a return to trust into an institution that determines what truth is, but trust in Jesus Christ, who is the truth and has revealed himself to us in his word. Episode 12. Symmetries as an evidence of creation. So in this podcast episode, I will talk about an article that I was allowed to write for the journal Studium Integrale. It's the volume 32, issue 2, and this is published by the study group Wort und Wissen, in which I'm engaged, for which I also wrote some articles already. And without further ado, I want to dive into this article, and I hope you can really understand what I'm talking about there. It's about symmetries and whether they can be an evidence for creation or for a creator. So, we encounter symmetries in many places in nature. The wings of butterflies, ice crystals, and even the human face can be considered approximately to be symmetrical. Human perception usually perceives symmetries as something beautiful, and they are of great importance in art and architecture. In physics, the concept of symmetry can be further generalized and an interesting connection can be made. For example, the laws of physics are symmetrical with respect to time shifts. So when we talk about symmetry, we usually are referring to mirror symmetries. However, there are other types of symmetry. For example, an object can also be symmetrical with respect to a rotation by a certain angle. In many cases, these symmetries serve a specific purpose. For example, double-headed snakes look the same from the front as they do from the back and are therefore rotationally symmetric under rotations of 180 degrees. When attacked, they raise their tails to deceive the attacker about the actual position of their heads. So what exactly is a symmetry? In the case of mirror symmetries around a specific axis, symmetry means the following. If everything on one side of the axis is transferred to the other side, it looks exactly the same as the original. A rotational symmetric body still looks the same as before, even after being rotated by a certain angle. This is the case with many flowers. In general, symmetry can be defined as follows, according to physicist Hermann Weyl. Something is considered symmetrical if you can do something to it so that after this action it looks exactly the same as before. This definition can be used to find symmetries beyond geometry. For example, symmetries can be found in mathematical equations. Such symmetries can be discovered particularly in the mathematical description of physical laws. The equations of motion in physics are invariant, that is, they do not change with respect to the transformation of certain variables. For example, the equations of motion do not change when the time is transformed, that is, regardless of when a throw is made, the trajectory does not change. The laws of physics are thus invariant or symmetric with respect to time translations or time shifts. The transformation with respect to which the mathematical equations are invariant can be derived analytically. This involves using the principle of least action, which states that a system always strives to minimize the energy required for the process. This can be illustrated by the paths of light. Light travels at different speeds in different media depending on how strongly it is refracted. If light has to pass through several media on a route between 2 points, for example through water and through air, the path is not the shortest route, but the path where the sum of the shortest times is required for the passage. This is then the path in which the light reaches the destination the fastest. This situation can be compared to a lifeguard who, in order to rescue a drowning person in a lake as quickly as possible, takes a longer route along the shore because he can move faster on land. If we calculate the paths of light and minimize the time required, we obtain Snell's law of refraction. This principle of the shortest times of the paths of light, or more generally, the minimization of energy required, can be formulated mathematically. The effect is calculated, or the action is calculated, which has then to be varied to determine the minimum. The results are the so-called Euler-Lagrange equations. From these we obtain the Lagrange function, which is of great importance in physics. It allows us to clearly determine whether the symmetry under the transformation of a certain whether there is a symmetry under the transformation of a certain variable. If the transformation of the variable changes the Lagrange function only by a time derivative, it will have no influence on the equations of motion and thus behave symmetrically. The importance of symmetries in physics becomes clear when they are linked to conserved quantities. Conserved quantities do not change and are at most converted into different forms of transfer to other bodies. An example of this is energy conservation. In a swinging pendulum, the energy is conserved throughout the entire swing and merely oscillates between kinetic and potential energy. Kinetic energy is the energy contained in the motion of the body. Potential energy is the position energy, that is, the energy that can be converted into kinetic energy due to the deflected position of the pendulum by the force of gravity. Noether's theorem establishes an interesting connection between symmetries and conservation laws. So, Emmy Noether was a mathematician who also contributed to theoretical physics. Her greatest achievement in the field of theoretical physics is Noether's theorem, named after her. It states that every symmetry results in a conserved quantity. Symmetry here refers to symmetry in the sense that I previously derived in physics. If such symmetries can be found in the physical system under investigation, it follows that there is a quantity that is conserved in the system. According to the theorem, the following conservation quantities underlay the common symmetries. Energy conservation follows from the homogeneity of time, that is, the fact that as described above, the outcome of a physical process does not depend on the time at which it is performed. From the homogeneity of space, that is, the fact that the outcome of a physical process does not depend on where in space it takes place, follows the conservation of momentum. From the isotropy of space, that is, the fact that the outcome of a physical process does not depend on the orientation of the system in space, follows the conservation of angular momentum. The symmetries shown here relate to space and time. Symmetries that indicate physical conservation quantities can also be purely mathematical symmetries that do not specifically relate to space and time. And we want to look at one of those, and this is our phase transitions in quantum mechanics. So in quantum mechanics, we can do such phase transition. And what this is so quantum mechanics is described by wave function. You can get this wave function using the Schrödinger equations, and these wave functions usually contain complex numbers. So complex numbers are an extension of the real numbers, and the real numbers are the numbers that you know from the number line. This is the set of all integers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on. Then numbers contained by fractions of those integers, and then also transcendental numbers like for example the number pi. The extension to complex numbers is achieved then by assigning a solution to the formula x squared plus 1 equals 0. Because if I calculate that, I put the 1 on the other side and I have x squared is equal to minus 1. I take the square root, and if I only stick to the real numbers, I don't know what to do now, because there's no solution in the real numbers for the square root of a negative number, and therefore I decide to just define it as a new number, and this number I call I for the imaginary unit, and this number I is now basically what happens when I take the square root of minus 1. Or in another way defined, if I square I get minus 1 as a number. And if I now have this new number, I can build a complex number which is consists of a real part, so a number in the real numbers, and also an imaginary part that consists of a number that consists also of a real number, but is where this I, this imaginary unit, is added. So then this complex number would be something like, complex number Z is something like A, some real number, plus bi, where b is also some real number and I is the imaginary unit. If we consider the real part and the imaginary part as coordinates, so we have now this complex number and we consider the real part and the imaginary part, we split them up and consider them to be coordinates, then the complex number can be viewed as a point in a two-dimensional plane. So if you just imagine a two-dimensional plane where you have an x-axis and a y-axis, and then on the x-axis you say you have the real part of the complex number, and on the y-axis you have the imaginary part of the complex number. And so you can basically describe such a number as a point in there. So if you have, for example, the complex number 2 plus 3i, then you have to go in the coordinate system to go 2 to the right on the x-axis and 3 up on the y-axis, and this point then would be a representation of this complex number. And you can, of course, if you now look at this closer, you can see you can draw a line from 0, 0 into this point, and then you will also have another way to show this number, and this is by this line, the length of this line, which we for now call the radius, and then also the angle that is between the x-axis and this line, which we will call the phase. So, and this radius is called a radius because what it is basically a radius. It's a distance, and you can compute it following the theorem of Pythagoras. There you can see that if you take the x-axis and the y-axis, and you see then they enclose a rectangular triangle with this point, and then you can use the square sum of those and take the square root to get the length of this radius. So this is the one quantity, and then you have also this phase between this point in the complex plane and the x-axis. So what's now important is that what for physics is important, so does this all mean physically? So we saw these complex numbers are in the wave functions and they are used there, and what does this wave function physically mean? So if I take the square, so this radius basically, and if I take this, then this gives me a probability in quantum mechanics. This gives me a probability of something, that something will occur. But then you can realize, okay, if it's only about this radius, I can basically turn this point of my complex number, and as long as I keep the radius constant, I will have the same result. I will, if I only take this radius with me and leave the phase B, then I can get the same result no matter where I will be on the circle with this radius. So I can, in the plane, I can then basically draw a circle with this radius, and every point on this circle will have the same radius, the same length, the same length, and therefore the same will have the same quantity as the one complex number I mentioned before. It will have a different phase, but since this phase does not matter, I can forget about it. And this means that the physics, quantum physics, is symmetric under these phase transitions. So if I make a phase transformation in this plane, then this does not affect quantum mechanics, and this symmetry has also a conserved quantity, a really basically physically conserved quantity, and what's conserved here is the probability. So I said that these wave functions describe probabilities, and of course you can only have a probability of at most one of something happening. That a probability of 1 that something will happen, or 100% that something will happen, mean it will happen to 100%, it will happen. So it can, and you cannot have more than that. You cannot have it will happen more certain than absolutely certain, right? So therefore the probabilities that we deal with in quantum mechanics need to be conserved. It cannot be that there are basically probabilities that are higher than 100%, and this is taken care of by dissymmetry. Dissymmetry leads to a conserved probability. If we now go further into quantum field theory, then it gets really interesting, because there we will also have these complex phases, or these phases in a complex plane that are where the physical equations are invariant under it. However, they are in this case now, in general, they can be more dimensional, and they can also have be not local anymore, but be depend on where in space you are. You can have a different phase, and this leads to interesting terms coming up, interactions terms we call them, because they lead to interactions of for example, the electromagnetic interactions and so on. They give these terms, and what they make, the symmetry that we have there, what this makes sure is that the charges, so the electromagnetic charge and the charges of the other interactions, that they are conserved. So this charge conservation is yielded by such symmetry under these phase transformations. So it's really, really interesting. So I hope you could in some way follow what I was saying. So if not, it's not that important. It's just, let's just understand there are symmetries that are purely mathematical, but they still have lead to physical conservation laws. And these purely mathematical symmetries imply conservation quantities in the natural sciences raise a question that already was asked by Eugene Wigner. Why is mathematics so effective in the sciences in describing the observable nature? What is astounding about this is not only the fact that mathematics provides an effective description of nature, but especially that the human mind is also equipped with the ability to comprehend it. In his paper and on the subject, Wigner writes that this is surprising from a Darwinian naturalistic perspective. He says, "It is certainly hard to believe that our thinking ability has been brought to the perfection it seems to possess by Darwin's process of natural selection. If like Galileo we consider mathematics to be the language of the natural sciences, then it is indeed remarkable that humans are able to speak this language. In the case of everyday physical effects, this can perhaps be explained speculatively from an evolutionary perspective by adaptations due to selection pressures. However, this does not explain how it can be that events that cannot be directly grasped by humans, such as those of quantum mechanics, can be accurately described using the same mathematical language." Wigner writes, "This shows that a mathematical language has more to commend it than being the only language we can speak. It shows that it is, in the truest sense of the word, the right language. From a viewpoint that believes in creation, this comprehensibility of mathematics is not strange, but rather to be expected. In the Gospel of John, so John 1 verse 1 and the following verses, God is presented as the Word, or in Greek, the Logos. This is the same word from which our word logic derives. Furthermore, it says that everything was created through this Logos. The creation account also describes that man was created in the same image or likeness of God. It is not surprising that man, who is created in the image of the same Logos, or the same logic that also created the world, is endowed with the ability to speak and understand the logic or the language of this logic. The effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, which Wigner admired and which is illustrated here by the Noether theorem, can therefore be interpreted as an evidence of creation." Thank you for listening to the Follow the Lamb podcast. Now it's your turn. Please let me know what you think about this episode. If you are on Spotify, you can use the comment section below. Otherwise, you can go over to my Substack, youfollowthelamb.substack.com, and there you find all the podcast episodes as articles, and you can read them again if you like, and also comment on them. If you want to contact me directly, feel free to use the contact form at my webpage sci-faith.de/en/contact. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means it is only produced and marketed by me, and therefore I need your support. Share it with your friends, relatives, and everyone you think might be interested in hearing these episodes. Also, do not forget to give this podcast a 5-star rating and subscribe to it to never miss an episode. Thank you very much, and follow the Lamb.